Thank you, Ellen. Is everybody hear me okay? I know, a little bit else. All right. Thanks for sticking around. Like Ellen said, my name is Kyle Hart, and I'm the Education Coordinator for the West Michigan Environmental Action Council. It is quite a mouthful, so we go by WENIAC for short. I spoke to a little bit of you guys about kind of what we do, but we're based in Grand Rapids. We're a nonprofit organization that's been around for longer than I have, for sure. And we do a lot of education, advocacy, kind of community outreach. My primary responsibility is working with K-12 students, speaking about current environmental issues that affect their health, our natural resources, things about water, things about energy, different kinds of pollution. And I'm joined today by three remarkable panelists who will be speaking about their firsthand experiences with environmental injustices in West Michigan. So first we have Paula Collier with the Grand Rapids neighborhood organization Seeds of Promise. Paula will be discussing her experience as a resident in a neighborhood with the largest EPA trichloroethylene monitoring site in the United States. TCE is an industrial solvent commonly used in dry cleaning, and a plume of it is slowly migrating through the Grand Rapids neighborhood that is primarily populated by African American and Hispanic residents. Paula is also co-chair of the Seeds of Promise Environmental Impact Team, and so she'll be discussing her personal experience today, kind of representing that community as they struggle through these health effects that are largely unknown. Thank you, Paula, for being here today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Alex Markham with the Healthy Homes Coalition of West Michigan, a grassroots organization that addresses harmful housing conditions that affect children's health. The Grand Rapids zip code 49507 has a higher rate of childhood lead poisoning than Flint. Alex will be speaking about her experience addressing lead and other concerns such as radon and carbon monoxide with policy advocacy, education, and action. Thank you, Alex, for joining us today. And last but not least, we have Deirdre, who is a doctoral teaching assistant at the Institute for Intercultural and Anthropological Studies at Western Michigan University. That's a mouthful as well. You need a new acronym for that. She is researching climate change adaptation and mitigation, the displacement of people due to climate change, and cultural anthropology. She will present on citizen activism through speaking to elected officials, as well as the challenges faced explicitly by the marginalized populations affected by climate change. Thank you, Deirdre. So I'd like to start off this panel by providing some context about how the framework of environmental justice kind of fits into the broader scope of environmental action. So as a member of an Environmental Action Council, I work alongside communities to protect and preserve their natural resources, such as rivers, wetlands, dunes, and other natural areas at risk of degradation. Being a regional organization that services 8 counties around West Michigan, we often engage in kind of broad scale, like top-down management through education and restoration and kind of community activism. Environmental justice operates on a different scale. It is personal. Its crimes are immediate. Environmental justice is about advocating for those who are disconnected from the conventional means of protection and have their health or safety compromised, often by entities who purposefully externalize that damage upon marginalized communities. Today, our panelists will share their personal definitions of what environmental justice means to them and the communities that they serve. So, Paula, let's start with you. You're here today representing the neighborhood who has the highest concentration of TCE in the nation, a chemical whose health effects are largely unknown at this time. Can you share with us, the audience, your experiences working firsthand with your neighbors affected by this contamination?
Thank you.
Of course.
Good afternoon. I live in the Southtown community of Grand Rapids, Madison Hall Street community, and I can tell you that we still have not had the final answer on the outcome. What we do know is that one day we were working, doing a job, performing a service, and then we came to work one day and they told us, leave, right away, lock the doors, everything that had fabric, the rugs, the chairs, everything had to be destroyed. So I imagine if everything had to be destroyed, what about our bodies? We were breathing this toxic gas that we still have no answers for. We had to go immediately to the health department, get tests, And the result was we had high levels of this chemical, TCE, and the apartment that was above our building, where we work in our operations, they had to be put in a hotel for a duration of time. No one has any answers, and we're still here wondering. We did have a couple of people that since then has passed away. We have had people have environmental breast cancer. We're not sure of the connection. We haven't been able to really investigate or really prove anything, so we've just been left here just still wondering and waiting to see what will happen. You know, that's kind of scary. So.
Thank you, Paula. I would like to turn it over to Alex Markham now, who is here representing the Healthy Homes Coalition. So Alex, your organization is the definition of grassroots, right? It's neighbors helping neighbors transform their living space into a safe and healthy environment. Can you share with us some of the programs that Healthy Homes offers to the community, maybe to
Yeah, get a little bit of context for it. All right, well, we have a number of programs that address housing hazards at all different levels. So one of the main barriers that we find is that grant funding to provide these programs or access to these programs really only comes when we're responding to something, which means that we are just waiting until it gets bad enough to where we need to do something about it. So we are looking at ways to get ahead of that. We have a number of programs. So in response to things, we have our direct services program, which looks at lead poisoning. But again, a child has to be like just so lead poisoned before we could get into that space to have resources to even be able to go. And then also asthma, because we know that asthma leads to a number of missed days for a lot of kids inside of the city of Grand Rapids. And so now we're trying to get ahead of it. We have our peer education program, which is where people work with their own networks and try to get out into different homes. That's all prevention education. And then now we have a new program through the county where we're looking at doing a home assessment or having a home assessment tool that for home visitors. So again, like trying to get to kids before they're lead poisoned, trying to get to kids before they end up in the ER over and over again for things like asthma flares.
Can you guys hear me on the lapel mic okay? All right, I'll let you keep that one then.
All right, sorry, I just remembered one more thing, sorry. So it's actually, I'm the community organizer, so it's the program that I run, so I don't know why I just forgot that one, but we have Parents for Healthy Homes, which is a grassroots organization of parents and grandparents and concerned citizens that look at addressing these barriers. We elevate community voices. We have a really strong focus on people who have been affected by these things because while we have a lot of policymakers that are making these big decisions, very few of those people have ever actually come in contact with these things. They haven't affected their families, they haven't lived in these neighborhoods and not been able to kind of leave those spaces. So, so policy. So we did work with the county last year. We got additional 2 sanitarians for Kent County so they can actually go and start to go into homes and establish that those hazards are there so then we can do something about it. And then now we're looking at raising the standards of living for every resident in Grand Rapids when it comes to rental property codes.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Now we'd like to hear from Deirdre Courtney. So she is a PhD candidate at Western Michigan University, again, studying the effects of climate change on marginalized communities. It is most likely that they are often make the least contribution to climate change, but are first to feel its effects. Can you share with us how you apply an environmental justice lens in your studies and when you work with policymakers to understand the needs of these communities?
So really my experience is more of a personal experience. I study climate change. I'm a person that studies climate change at the university. I'm a PhD student, and my research involves me going out into communities that are impacted. So Native American communities, I've done research there where they're suffering from issues like inundation or coastal erosion and those types of issues that sort of impact their communities. But what I'd like to say about what I do or how I've gotten involved is that I'm I'm a person of the community that is being impacted the most. And so as a mom and as a grandmother, I really, I go beyond my education, basically. What's important to me is to find ways to educate the community in which I'm a part of. So getting involved in education in terms of like climate change, it wasn't something that I just grew up to say this is something that I wanted to do, something that I would ultimately go into, but it was something that was kind of like dropped in my lap. But after gaining the education and skills, I wanted to take that and give back to the community in which I'm a part of. So from that, I started to go out into the community and do different types of events such as these, like speaking on behalf of marginalized populations and, you know, pretty much telling their stories. So it's a twofold situation with me where it's part of education and part of like advocacy.
Thank you, Deirdre. These are three powerful perspectives brought here today, and I'm excited to engage with some conversation with you all soon. Your stories are very valuable for us to hone our own environmental justice lenses. I'd like to kick off the discussion with this opening question. Feel free to start whomever would like to. So unfortunately, we often see the effects of these injustices kind of after the fact, where these communities are already suffering the health effects or the concerns of the impact. So my question is, how can we transition the environmental justice framework from a reactive process to one that is proactive and kind of do more preventative measures?
Well, I can start with that. I'm involved with an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. And through Citizens Climate Lobby, I am able to lobby legislators in Lansing, and we do some local work in our area to speak to legislators on behalf of individuals that can't always speak on behalf of themselves. So about 2 years ago, I was invited to attend a lobby day in Washington, D.C. And at the time, it was more or less for me, I was excited about being able to get a free trip to Washington, D.C. and to meet some individuals that I had never met before. But it became a life-changing experience for me. Citizens Climate Lobby, they're a nonpartisan organization that lobbies legislators on behalf of citizens that are impacted by climate change. So from my educational background, I'm already aware of the fact that there are marginalized communities out here that are suffering. And again, like I said, I'm also a part of these communities. So I thought this would be a great chance for me to speak to legislators who I don't typically see in my community and kind of give them an example of what we're facing in our community. So it became more of just, you know, a trip for me, but an actual way for me to get out and spread the word in terms of what people of color are dealing with in their communities.
All right, I think to get ahead of it in this space where I work, there needs to be a really honest focus on corrective justice. So that is looking at policy change and who is responsible for this. And right now, the way that the system is set up inside of Grand Rapids and Kent County, the responsibility falls on the families. And the families are already in this space where they didn't ask for this to happen. So one of the things that I've noticed, a consistent theme through all the presentations that I've seen today, is that it tends to be, these things happen because of businesses, right? Someone comes in and they're like, all right, well, we're just going to do this and no one's watching and we don't have to answer to anybody, and so it's I guess then it's okay, right? And obviously it's not, because there are really real lasting health effects. So now, because a lot of those businesses then are gone, especially where we work, which is in rental properties, those paint companies, they're where are they now? And so then it falls to the landlords, and if that's not corrected in that space, then it's falling to the city and the county to hold these people accountable, and that's messy, right? It's really, really messy. It's long, and it's hard, and it's costly, but it's necessary. And so those are things that we have to do. Those are things that have to happen. The problem's not going to correct itself. It hasn't corrected itself so far. And we see these things happen over and over and over again, and there needs to be a stop point. We need to have responsibility in all different levels, and we need to make sure more than anything, like absolutely more than anything, we need to make sure that we stop blaming the families.
And to also add, this situation in Southtown happened over 40 years ago, so the laws were very lax and people were not held accountable to their actions. So on both sides, the business owner who owned the cleaners was pouring chemicals out the back door, just throwing chemicals out, which the chemicals dissolved into the soil, into the ground, and then when 40 years later, there was a development which caused that ground to break, of course, to do the development, which caused that chemical, that toxic chemical, to wake up and to run down through the city, down the center of our area, community. And then we start to breathe this invisible monster. It was like, it was a lady that was pregnant. We don't know her outcome, what will happen with her baby. Hopefully the baby is healthy. So far, so good, and she has been very healthy. There was one guy that worked in the office who had COPD. He ended up expiring. He's deceased now. And we had another young lady who had asthma, and now she had to move into a nursing facility, and she has to have oxygen 24 hours a day. So those 3 people were affected by this TCE chemical, and we don't know actually what the outcome for the rest of us will be, but the laws were so lax because they allowed people just to not be concerned about one another. We have to care about each other. I have to care about you. You have to care about me. We have to care about how we treat this earth. And just don't, I know people who pour, what they call it, Crisco, like cooking oil, out the back door. Yeah. You don't know what the long-term effects of that will be. People have to be very careful to pour paint out the door. You don't do that. This is our earth. And we need to protect her. We need to protect her. She's beautiful. We need to protect her. And education is going to be the way to do that. So that's what I wanted to add on that.
And I'd like to just piggyback on this, the notion about education. Again, because I am someone that studies climate change, I don't typically see a lot of individuals that are African American and females that are studying at the PhD level this issue. And so it's very important for me that I go out and try to educate people not only as it relates to what is climate change, but also what are the impacts. And I think that's what's incumbent upon us all that have the education to go back and give to the community in that way. So for me, one of the biggest things, I guess, as it relates to lobbying in Washington or even at the local area, I like to get the message out that the legislators who proclaim to care for the community in which they are purportedly supposed to serve, that they are actually concerned with the community being educated. Because I can only speak for myself, but I'm only one black person, and I can't be at 2 places at once. But as a society, we can go out and do more in the community to educate people of color. The people that have the education should do more to get the word out. So I
Let me add that to you real quick. I think, I believe in just boots on the ground, just very basic. If you learn something new, share it. It don't matter, it doesn't matter really who you are, We also had focus groups at the office where we invited people in, and we offered them $20 to answer some questions about recycling. Because they were just, putting all kinds of stuff in the recycling bin and didn't understand that it would have to be separated. So just if you learn something new, you share that information. It's just that simple.
Thank you so much. It seems like there's a nice cross-cutting thread of accountability and education as well. And hopefully, with a focus on those two things, we can, incorporate more environmental justice lenses into frameworks such as different levels of government, higher level education, and accepting those issues and making those legitimate from voices that are often not heard. I'd like to now take any questions from the audience. If there is anybody who has a question card or two, feel free to bring those up. Or Colin's running them up. Thank you. All right, question. This is for Paula. It says, do you have any hope of organizing for action or receiving any legal help?
As a matter of fact, we haven't thought about legal help as of yet, but we have considered, we do have Environmental Justice Coalition groups formed, that we have monthly meetings. I work with WMEAC. WMEAC is a leader in our community, and they have been very ambitious when it comes to educating us and giving us tools to, I involved myself with the walks. We come into we had the mayor out there cleaning up one day. We said, hey, come on, and clean up these alleys and stuff. She was like, come on, she came on. And, just helping us to, get engaged. We may have collaborations and stuff, with partners, community partners, and endorsing partners. We just decided to, if the government didn't help us, we talked to the DEQ, and they just kind of dropped the ball, but, we just kept it going. So we haven't thought about doing any legal actions at all. So.
Thank you. This question is for Alex. You mentioned you help people in rental homes and issues. Do you help people who are low income, who bought a home with issues? How can low income families who own homes test for and get help with these issues?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So one of the things that we have found, particularly over the last month or two even, so we're working on part of program development is putting together all the different resources that are out there. So again, we have limited funding based on the grants we're able to find for our work. There are resources out there for low-income families that are homeowners. We've actually put together a list of all resources and then went through and identified, going over, they say, was it requirements? We say barriers. Right. Yeah, it's a thing. So we have all of that. So my table's out there, business cards are out there, but those things do exist. It's difficult though because a lot of those programs are also grant funded. So they come and they go and then they disappear for a bit and they come with different requirements, or earlier there were conversations about how long it can take to get a contractor out for these things. But we look primarily, so one of our focuses too, which actually overlaps with your work, Deirdre, is that we are looking at the overlap when with lead and carbon monoxide and mold, and then work for weatherization and sustainability to try to pair up as many of those programs as we can to make those homes as healthy as possible.
Thank you. I have another question for Paula. As I listen to the news regularly and have never heard of the TCE issue, but have you heard of lots of ongoing coverage of the Rockford PFAS issue? So do you think that there was a lack of news coverage on the TCE issue? Seems like it's almost insinuating intentional lack of coverage, maybe due to the scale or the demographics. What are your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. I believe there was a ball dropped there because sometimes marginalized communities don't get the same attention as other areas that are more populated, maybe with more money or more less diversity. But we have to face that. That's the reality of our world that we live in. People don't add as much concern to marginalized communities, and we might hear it today, may not hear it again. But the PFAS issue was on TV for a long time, and we still hear about that issue. And it's a serious issue, and not to diminish that, but the vapor intrusion was also. We still haven't heard the final outcome. I just got some blood work done, and it said high concentration levels. Okay, so now what do I do with that? Follow up with your doctor and with a $400 bill to go with that. And that was the conclusion of that. And so we have to continue to stress to the health department. They come to our environmental justice meetings. They pretend to be interested, but that's about as far as it's gotten. So, thank you.
Is there any other questions from the audience? I do have some prepared just in case. It's a great segue into one of these. It says, most often the cases of environmental injustice occupy spaces that are invisible, or at least perceived invisible to the privileged that are not affected. How can we bring those spaces to the light and convince those that are not affected that these issues are valid, that there should be more coverage on marginalized communities who might not have the time to speak for themselves?
Well, I'm very encouraged, at least in Southtown, that there are so many collaborations. We work also with Healthy Homes. We work with Link Up, the Link Gallery. We have the Center for Transformation. We have a lot of collaboration in our community. You know, we know that we need to build bridges and not walls. We need to work together. We need to find ways to identify our strengths and weaknesses, do a SWOT, find out where we can help each other. Because it is true that this nation that we live in, this world that we live in, has rules for both sides. They have some rules for some and other rules for others. And it's invisible, but you have to know it. You have to know it anyway. You have to kind of know it, what it is. You have to do your homework, and you have to be very proactive in getting, working with other people. If they don't reach out to you, you reach out to them. You reach out to them. You find these people. You find these people that you need to get resources from. And I'm a strong advocate for being a voice for people who are not able to speak for themselves. So that's what I do. I thank you very much.
And for me, I can say that this is a very good question, because as it relates to my own research that I do, as it relates to going out and finding locations to do research as it relates to climate change, I personally had to do the research and contact Native American communities that in a lot of cases are very closed off to outsiders coming in and just sort of penetrating their communities. And I didn't have anyone within the university to help me to sort of navigate those spaces. So for me, I had to go find the locations, make connections with these communities, and then be invited into their spaces. And what I learned from that experience is that sometimes we have to do the extra work to go out into the communities, try to make a relationship with these individuals, and to hear their voices. If we're just speaking from a position where we're trying to help you, but we aren't listening to where you actually need the help, then that community might be less inclined to have you sort of come and speak for them or speak with them and ultimately speak on their behalf. So with some of the indigenous communities that I've had to work with, once I was able to get into the community and speak to the people, they were very welcoming. And I think it's the same thing for African American communities, and it's one of the things that I'm very passionate about. I see a lot of groups that say they speak on behalf of African Americans, but I don't necessarily see the groups in these spaces and hearing the voices of these individuals, because sometimes the messages can be mixed. If you hear from African Americans themselves or people of color, what are your true concerns? Maybe they're dealing with other types of issues, and once they can get over those barriers, they can hear the conversations about climate change and other things that are impacting their community. So I think we have to sort of get outside of our own comfort zone. And I know through my education, I was kind of pushed and forced to do that. So.
That's very powerful. We have another question that says, is it now mandatory to have a phase 1, so preliminary environmental testing, before any development is done to find these issues in Grand Rapids?
Yeah, I believe there has been some initiatives that's been put in place for when development happens. They have some certain requirements to meet because that was such a huge development and the spread of that toxic chemical. I was going to add also, though, we cannot overlook communities that Latinx communities, because they sometimes get overlooked because we might think that it's an issue trying to communicate with them. There's ways. Go to the Hispanic centers and stuff, get people to help you communicate because it's very necessary. We want to make sure everybody's included. This is our world, our world. So, thank you very much.
Alex, do you follow up on this question? Is there any kind of lead safety standards, or what is the disclosure process for when you are buying a home or renting a home?
I'm going to try to not get angry while answering that question. Right. So the biggest problem with disclosure when it comes to lead is that there's this like nonsense standard of I don't know that it's there, right? And so if there hasn't been an assessment, like a full assessment done, then it's like, well, we don't know. And even when there's a lead poisoned child inside of the house, there can be a debate about where they were actually exposed, and it just becomes this murky mess, right? So right now, we don't really have standards. I mean, we're fortunate in Grand Rapids that we have proactive rental inspections. Lead is part of that, but also the main cause of lead poisoning inside the city of Grand Rapids is lead dust, and you can't see that, right? And it's everywhere. Children crawl around. It's developmentally appropriate that they put everything inside of their mouths, and that's how it happens. And the number of conversations that I have had with landlords where it's like, well, we just need to educate them to not poison themselves. I have actually heard that, and I'm not kidding. And it's like, okay, no. So yeah, we don't have those standards. We have a really amazing ability if our city can step up and make really, brave. They are brave because it comes with a price tag. Decisions to prioritize children's health and particularly to prioritize because our children's health is really the future health of our city, and that should be a priority. So to make that choice, to invest in that, and then also our numbers over time have come down as far as like the rate of childhood lead poisoning. And now there's, it's kind of we've reached almost like this scary point where they're like, all right, well, we've done enough and now that's good enough and that's kind of it. But if you look at the people who remain inside of that space, the people who are affected, they're typically people that are living in poverty, and then people that are marginalized. And so it's not good enough to say that this is good enough. So we definitely need much stricter standards on that.
And also people of color are typically not believed when they're addressing a complaint about their health. It's either they don't know what's going on with themselves. If your body doesn't feel healthy, I don't care what color you are, you typically know if you don't feel healthy. But oftentimes, I think that has a lot to do with the, finances of a person. When you're forced to go into an emergency room, or you're forced to go into an urgent care, and you're not getting proper treatment because whatever this thing is that's ailing you, you don't know yourself. I may not be able to articulate it, what the actual problem is, but I definitely don't feel healthy. And so people are typically turned away in those cases, and those, conditions exacerbated are prolonged and ultimately can lead to, bigger issues or even death. So I think the solution for that is, being believed and trusted. Again, if the voices are not at the table, no one's having this conversation. We don't understand that these are the things that are actually taking place and going on in specific communities.
Absolutely. I think building those authentic connections is definitely the first step towards legitimizing these issues and bringing all voices to the table. I mean, I'm sure a lot of these communities have always had a voice, but maybe they've fallen on deaf ears or so. I have another question here for Paula. What is the extent of the TCE contamination? Is it city blocks? Can you say something to the number of individuals or properties?
The TCT, it ran from, let me see, to give you an approximation, I would have to say several blocks. It ran from a point where it went downstream. So it went from Hall and Madison, if you could identify where that area is. It went from Hall and Madison all the way across Division Street, and it crossed over to Cottage Grove. It crossed, made a curve and went another direction. So it was several blocks of contamination. And what the DEQ ultimately ended up doing, they went into homes. They said they weren't allowed into every home, so they couldn't get in to do a thorough test. So they said any home that had, how in my basement I had this hole that by my washer and dryer, it was like a drain hole where the water comes, like the water empties out. They said the TCT was coming into homes through that hole. And so that's how it was getting into the residents. And so they did find some residents that had the contamination in their home because it came through that hole. So we had to implement something to plug up that hole so that it wouldn't come in. So, like I said, we also lived near a train. And so my mother, when she developed breast cancer, her breast cancer was environmental, and we weren't certain if it was from the train or from the TCE. They did not find the TCE in her home, but the next street over is Cottage Grove, where they did find the TCE. So it was like, we didn't know really what to think, because there was so many areas where the TCE was found, and so they still haven't really got a handle on it to tell us any outcomes. So, thank you.
This next question is actually a question for myself. Are there any sample tests for toxins that citizens could use for detections? Could we fund this through grants? I think one thing, I'm definitely not a toxicologist or anything like that. I'll give you that disclaimer right now. But I think some sample tests, obviously you can do soil in your lead, or lead in your soil, in your water, but often it's tough to assume that everyone would know what to test for, and that can be an extreme barrier to people that, nobody is an expert in TCE until they have to be, right? Nobody is expert in PFAS change until it affects their life or their partner dies from it, right? So just kind of shot in the dark, I might have lead, I might have this thing, I think that can be an extreme barrier just to dump money into tests, or if you have your water sent out to a lab, you have to tell them what you'd like to get out of that. So I think that can be kind of, a barrier for sure, a requirement, but barrier in a sense for the EJ lens that, these people shouldn't have to be the experts, right? I think we've, through our discussion here, have seen kind of a thread of where does the responsibility lie, and why is it on the affected? Why isn't it on the polluter, but instead on the polluted? So I think that's a very roundabout answer, not so much for what the exact question, but could we fund this through grants? It seems like, unfortunately, that might be the most common source of funding right now, especially through lead abatement and asbestos and things like that, is our question always kind of boils down to money, right? And it's seemingly that the money is not coming from the businesses that have been profiting off of externalizing these pollutants to marginalized communities, but now it's reverse bottom-up kind of grassroots from the community, dedicating their times to all of a sudden becoming experts in the field for their own sake, which is very unfortunate. So, yeah, are there sample tests? Yes, definitely. I mean, we get to see the example of PFAS test for $60. Should the onus of testing your water be on you? In my opinion, personally, no, definitely not. I mean, nobody should live in fear that the water that they drink or that they get out of their tap at somewhere could potentially be poisoned to them. I think access to clean water is a healthy right, and that peace of mind that goes along with what you consume and the environment that you live in goes hand in hand with that.
Can I just add to that?
Absolutely.
I'm also a member of our environmental board in the city of Portage, and I would encourage you, if you are interested in finding out if there are tests, if you contact your local municipality, because they may have some things that they're working on in terms of getting testing for the area. They may also be doing testing. We're doing testing in our area, so that may be a good avenue for someone who wants to get more information.
And I also wanted to add that it was so vital to have communication from the powers that be, okay? It's essential. They have to be able to communicate clearly with the community, the residents, that we pay taxes, we live here, this is our home. And one day they came in January, they placed this little cylinder on the counter and said, we was like, oh, what's that for? It's like, oh, we just doing an air quality test. So they sat there, and it sat there for months, until May. Then they came back and say, everybody out. It's like, okay, really? You knew what this was. You had an idea. You had to have an idea, because you placed this cylinder in our office, and it was collecting data all this time. You knew something. You knew something. You didn't even give us a hint. And just come in one day and say, evacuate. Really? So communication is like essential.
I have, is it okay?
Yeah.
Something to add? Okay. So similar to that point, we had, 49507 in Grand Rapids as the most lead poisoned children in one zip code in the entire state, and more so than Flint. And so, but the thing is that that's not new. Like that's been there for years, and to Paula's point, nobody talked about it. Just no one talked about it. And healthy homes existed before then. We had been addressing lead before then, but as far as like community priority and things that were actually being discussed, it just wasn't happening until after Flint. And then, once there's a crisis, it's like, oh wait, what's the state of this inside of our city? And we're like, all right, well, welcome to the discussion now, right? And so now we have people inside the city, the people who make those decisions are actually talking about it now. They're, the city of Grand Rapids just put out a legislative agenda out into Lansing, and lead is one of the top 4, which is wonderful, but also like this is not a new problem, and the communication inside of that space has been sorely lacking.
So I mentioned earlier, I forgot to mention something earlier when I mentioned about all of my trips to DC. Part of my lobbying there is for the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, and I'm becoming more familiar with the HR 763 bill that we're trying to get enacted and passed through the legislature, that will tax organizations that are or the polluters, and ultimately give a dividend back to homes. And so I encourage each of you back to sort of get more familiar with that bill, and spread the word on that.
Can you say that number one more time? HR what?
HR 763.
Looks like we might have time for one last question, and this is a fantastic one to end on. How can we, as in the quote, pale and steel, be better allies for the voices of people of color and the challenges of climate advocacy and economic disparity?
I think everyone here today, especially if you're concerned about nature, you're concerned about the environment, you're doing a great job. But that can't be it. We also have to be concerned about the individuals whose voices aren't being heard and who aren't at the tables typically. So if there's ways for you within your organization to invite more individuals out in the community, or even to go into these communities and hear from them and see the ways that you can help them, I think that'd be a great start.
I would like to add, this is just real talk. Some doors I can't access in America because it's real, right? Some doors you can access in America. And I think that if we work together, those doors that I can't access, you can access. You can help us to work together and knock some of these doors down, open these doors, opportunities, and get the resources and services and funding that we need.
I think the general, takeaway that we can just have from that last statement is creating authentic connections, I think, is the first step. Not so much putting environmental justice as an afterthought in the pillars of an organization or the mission statement, but seriously taking the time to integrate it within the framework of how you operate internally, how you communicate externally, and then that will bleed into how you live your daily life. And creating those authentic connections will, again, open doors for communities that might not have their voices heard. So if you find yourself with a mic, use it. Connect with those who might not have as much power or speaking. So let's see what time is it.
Time for one more if you want.
Time for one more? All right. We a little bit covered this question already, but it's directed to Paula and Alex. What is your experience has been with working with elected officials in terms of advocacy and action? Might be a loaded question, but
I love that question.
let's
Well, they know that I'm coming, so I tell you, I haven't made it everywhere, but I'm coming. I have been on the planning commission for the city of Grand Rapids. I've served for a year. My term just ended January 6th. And I've been trying to get in those places that everybody can't get in. I facilitate a women's group of women who have been incarcerated. So a lot of the women that I work with don't have access to a lot of things because they have a criminal background. So I'm able to go into places where I can maneuver where they can't and try to get some resources. I find that a lot of people will raise havoc about different political personalities, but until you get into a space where you need to find out what their platform is, really get serious about this and research. Get up next to them. And I go to these things. I make myself available to go to these things and find out what they're thinking and who they really are authentically, to find out if they're for me or if they're against me, or how I can work with elected officials and just find out who they really are. I think this is critical to get those that information.
So Parents for Healthy Homes works with elected officials, everyone from city commission all the way up. We've done some national, federal level education. We tried not to call it loud education. So one of the things that is really interesting, I actually learned from someone at the National League of Cities, was you find the piece that you have in connection, right? The thing that you have in common. And it's surprising, there are times when even with our city commission, I've gotten on the phone with somebody and it's like, when I go into it, it's like they're not gonna wanna talk to me, this isn't gonna go anywhere well, I'm gonna hang up and be even more angry than when I even dialed, right? But there are things that you really can find in common. And the thing is, the initial work may not always be perfect, and that can be really, really difficult when it's something that you really care about, right? And especially when it's something that you have experience in, you're trying to educate this person who makes the decisions, which already is not the greatest power dynamic, right? But it's having that starting point, having that relationship, having a place where at least, you know, someone that you can call up and be like, hey, and actually we're really, really fortunate, I'm just gonna give him a shout out because he's great. Commissioner Hart has been like our champion inside of this work, where he, even at this point, when we started moving from Lead-Free Kids GR, which is the mayor's city group, over to the Lead Action Task Force, something, and then they call that, that's the combination of the city and the county together. You know, he got a hold of us and was like, I want to talk to you about, you know, how you feel about this and what the next steps are. And so we sat down and, you know, we told him what we needed. And I think in a really important part of that conversation too is asking him, like, what do you need from us, right? Like, how can we actually work together? And somebody in an earlier group even said, you know, when you show up, you have to show up repeatedly, like over and over and over again. And you need to be like stern and not ease up, but also be reasonable and try to find, again, those common spaces.
Can we get a round of applause for